Oh yeah, we're going back in time for this one. Hey guys, Caleb here from CDBS Studios, and today we're talking about a movie that I didn't think I was ever going to get to talk about on this channel, as outside of like a ranking video or something. As this is the first episode in a new series I'm trying out called Retrospective Review, a series where instead of reviewing new movies like I usually do, I'm going to go back and review older movies that I really want to talk about. And this film, you may have heard of it, called Back to the Future, is one of the most popular movies in the sci-fi kind of genre, and it is also one of my favorite films of all time. It is currently my third favorite film of all time. And conveniently, this is also the 40th anniversary of Back to the Future. And if you didn't know, because of this film being its 40th anniversary, they re-released it this year in IMAX. And while I was going in to watch this movie in IMAX, it started to hit me as, why is this movie stuck around in our pop culture? And does it still hold up after 40 years? So I decided after watching it in IMAX that I was going to come back and I'm going to tell you guys why Back to the Future is still a phenomenal movie and relevant to society 40 years after it initially released. The first main reason why I think Back to the Future is such a timeless movie is the story and all of its little quirks and that work into it. One of the main things that's made Back to the Future so prominent in pop culture over the years is that the initial concept of the first movie is just such a timeless idea. This idea that a kid goes back in time 30 years and ends up meeting his parents. That's just a concept that is just anybody can find some way to relate to, as most of us will have had some kind of parents, and a lot of ways have this idea of, do you think we would be friends with our parents if we were young, if we were around when they were young? And that's the idea that Bob Gale took when he wrote this movie, and it just makes for such a timeless concept. Of course, the story of this movie is also really interesting as when Marty McFly goes back in time, he has to teach his father the ideas of standing up for himself and embracing his creativity. And it's just such a fun idea of Marty giving his dad advice that in a way somehow comes back onto Marty later in his life. And the other thing that I also always praise this movie on is that this movie's labeled as a sci-fi movie because of the whole time travel, but the sci-fi elements of Back to the Future are really kind of not very prominent, as you have the whole time travel sequence of Marty McFly goes back in time with the DeLorean time machine, but then the movie is just kind of a period piece for the rest of it, as the time travel stuff doesn't really come back at all, except for like fleeting references of now Marty's in the past and has to get his parents back together. Doesn't really come back up again till the clock tower sequence at the end of the film. The sci-fi elements of Back to the Future are really contained to just the beginning and the end. And then the rest of the movie is just a 50s period piece of basically a rom-com story, which I've always found so interesting, as this movie really panders to multiple genres, as not only being a sci-fi film, but also being a rom-com, also being a comedy, an action film at times. This movie is great by sprinkling in multiple different ideas across its runtime and makes it great. And the other thing I think that really also makes this film so great is the Chekhov's guns. Chekhov's gun, if many of you are unaware of the concept, is that this idea was created by a playwright named Chekhov, who had this idea that if you don't put a gun on stage unless you intend to fire it. And it basically comes down to this point in the same way as movies. You should never put something in a movie that seems prominent unless you intend to use it. And Back to the Future is phenomenal when it comes to Chekhov's guns in it, as you have some things in it that you don't think are important come back later. Jennifer writes her number on the clock tower flyer, and originally that just seems like it's just world building, we set up the clock tower, and then when we go back in time, that flyer is the entire key to Marty getting back to the present. And there's even so many things. Marty McFly gets rejected from playing the school dance in 1985. He gets to play the school dance at the end in 1955. And there's so many more things just like that. The Chekhov's guns in this. And this movie's so great. It even does that to where you don't even think something's important, and then it's prominent to the story, and it feels so great because the movie set it up, and it comes back in a meaningful way. And then I've mentioned it a few times as well. The comedy in this movie is just so fun, as the comedy in this movie is so, in a way, very sprinkled throughout and meant to give you something to laugh at in between the multiple set pieces we're moving through. And even in so many cases, the comedy of this movie was so good that it turns into literal running gags for the rest of the Back to the Future trilogy. And that just makes it, means that the comedy in this movie works so well, as there's so many points in this movie that have some pretty great comedy of Marty's banter with his parents. You've got Doc's whole eccentric personality. You've got all of the different jokes that Biff have, like how he can't complete one of the phrases, which are so funny, and I find myself quoting him so much. And that just makes the comedy. And the last piece of the story that I think really makes this movie great is the music. Every single song choice that they put in this movie is electrifying, and it adds to every scene. It's very much like the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, where they meticulously picked out each song that they were going to play in order to make the scenes they were going on better. Not only do they have some great undertones with the score, which is probably one of the most famous film scores in history, to great songs in there like Power of Love, and even the most famous one from this movie, Johnny Be Good, from the very end. Every song they add to this movie is added with meticulous thought, and it makes every single scene where the music shows up even better. And the story of this movie alone and all of these different elements is one of the main reasons why this movie is so good and why it stuck around for 40 years in our pop culture and society. But one of the other main reasons that Back to the Future is such a timeless classic is that the characters are just so great and they're so relatable. Marty and Doc are such interesting characters, as the movie paves a really interesting idea with the two of these characters where we don't really know a ton about them when we first meet them, as the movie even glosses over how Marty and Doc met, how Doc basically became a scientist, and there's so much of that niche ideas that they introduce in the story, and it makes you want to learn more about these characters. In fact, it's one of the reasons why many people have tuned into other Back to the Future media, the rest of the trilogy after this movie, the video games, the comics. They've all sprinkled throughout these movies different things about things like how Doc and Marty met, Doc's backstory, Marty's backstory, and it all paves a really clear connection about how the story runs its ideas, and it just makes you want to know who Marty and Doc are, and it makes it great. And they even play off each other so well, as Marty and Doc are able to play so well off of each other, from Doc's eccentric personality to Marty's idea to not really understand the science stuff, but he also knows enough to basically get by in this weird scenario he's now found himself in 1955. And it's so great. And my favorite character in this movie, surprisingly, is not Marty McFly. It's George. George is one of my favorite characters on a story and personality level, as when you first meet him in 1985, he's this kind of low stakes kind of character who's still bullied by his high school bully in 30 years after the fact. He kind of is low down, he's really disconnected from his life, and he's kind of held back in a lot of ways. And then when you meet him in 1955, you see the man he is going to become in 1985 so prominently, and Marty is the one who has to push him to start to open up, to fight back for himself against Biff, how he has to open up and starts writing his sci-fi stories that end up leading to him being successful when Marty returns to 1985. George is such a relatable character for me personally as a writer myself, and I've always found myself loving this character. And it's only made 10 times better by Crispin Glover's amazing acting performance in this movie. As, like most characters in the Back to the Future cast, he can play multiple iterations of the same character across time periods, and it feels seamless. The George we meet in 1985 original feels the exact same as the 1955 George when we first meet him. And then the character George turns into by the end of the 1955 sections makes it seem even more likable when we see him again in 1985 and it's the same character. It's just so great. And then I just love Biff in this movie. He is such a good, unredeemable villain, as he's this villain who never changes, but in defense, you never want to see Biff change. He is the same guy throughout the entire run of this movie, and it makes it so serendipitous when you finally get to the ending of it and he is just waxing McFly's car. That is such a great moment in the movie that's played for a joke, but it feels so good to see a character that you hate for the entire movie get his comeuppance, and it's so great, even leading to the whole manure gag that he used for the later movies. There is not a bad character in this entire cast. Every single character in Back to the Future is placed with meticulous intent, and all of their performances light fires as how good they are. I cannot even pick a character in this entire franchise in Back to the Future that I hate. Well, that's a lie. I can't pick any character I dislike. I can pick characters I hate, but you're supposed to hate those characters. You're not supposed to like Biff. You're not supposed to like his lackeys, but you still like the character and his performance, which I think is very important for making a movie like this one. But the last and I think most important reason why Back to the Future stuck around in our pop culture for so long is the fact that this movie is so rewatchable. There's so many background details in this movie that you don't initially pick up on a first viewing, but make the world feel so much more thought out than you ever thought of. The hobo that Marty McFly sees when he first gets back to 1985 that's on the bench is the mayor in 1955, and you don't pick that up on a first viewing. You see other background details that come up, like the Twin Pines Mall sign changing, the multiple different things we see changing across the film with the pictures. There's so much background details to not only this movie, but even the rest of the series that make this movie so much fun to rewatch because you start to pick up on those things, and it makes that you feel like they thought through every aspect of this world that they created, and it makes you want to learn more. And then I also love that even many instances in this movie call forward, and especially after watching the entire Back to the Future trilogy, you see how much they set up so much in this first movie. As while I still feel that this is such one of those instances where Back to the Future was such a tightly knit story, they didn't have a lot to tug on for the two sequels, they still found a way to tug on things for the sequels, not only carrying over things like the running gags, like Marty waking up and finding his mother, and all those other running gags that happen somehow across every time period, like the chase sequence outside of the restaurant that ends up in a whole fight sequence, even somehow translating to the 1885 era. And every single one of those call for you can find in this first movie, which just goes to show that they took such a great movie and expanded it to make such a amazing franchise. Even some of the running gags that happen in this first movie carry over to the cartoons, the games, the comics. This movie is a treasure trove for so many things that have stuck around in our pop culture, and the rewatchability of this movie is probably the most important reason why it stuck around in our pop culture for over 40 years. So, to put it kind of lightly, I really love this movie, if you couldn't have told. In fact, this movie is one of the easiest 10 out of 10s I've ever had to give in my entire life. As this movie not only is great on a first viewing, but the more and more I rewatch it, it's one of those movies that gets better and better as I slowly pick up on more background details, as I get to laugh more at more and more running gags, as I connect with these characters all over again. Seeing this movie in IMAX for the 40th anniversary was one of my favorite theater experiences I've ever had, as I got to see a movie that I've only ever had the chance to see on small screens because of when I was born. Was so great. And honestly, I wish I could have seen it opening day in 1985 because I know I would have loved it back then even as well. This is a movie that has almost zero negatives, and even the small negatives that might come from this movie are canceled out because there's 10 more phenomenal, amazing things that cancel out the like 3 negative things about this movie. And if you've somehow gone this long without seeing Back to the Future, please go watch it. And I highly doubt you'll be disappointed if you do, because it's sincerely that good of a movie. So, thank you guys all very much for watching this retrospective review, and let me know down in the comments if you've seen Back to the Future. What are your thoughts on the movie? Leave your comments and maybe we can get a conversation going. And if there's any other movies you want me to do retrospective reviews on, leave those in the comments down below, and maybe I'll get around to making them in 2026. Without further ado, thank you guys all very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.